We are accustomed to imagining medieval castles as majestic and impregnable structures, symbols of power and wealth. In our imagination, its halls are filled with torchlight, and fires crackle merrily in the fireplaces, warming knights and beautiful ladies. However, the reality of a winter night in a stone fortress was far from romantic and more reminiscent of a daily struggle for survival.
Help me!
When the sun set, the castle was plunged into piercing cold and almost complete darkness, transforming from a stronghold of safety into a stone trap. Every night became a test, where warmth, light, and life itself were precious resources that required constant monitoring and ingenuity. It was an era when comfort was measured not by the softness of the bed, but by the distance to the nearest source of fire. Watch the video to the end to find out what simple but ingenious device in the Lord's bedroom kept him from freezing, and why the Night Watch feared not only enemies, but also silence. The main merciless enemy of the castle's inhabitants on dark winter nights was not an external enemy besieging the fortress, but the very fundamental material from which its mighty walls were masterfully built. Stone has extremely high thermal conductivity, which means that it does not retain precious heat inside the rooms, but literally draws it out, like a giant heat pump working against the inhabitants of the castle. During the harsh winter months, the massive stone walls, sometimes several meters thick, froze through to the very foundation, turning into a colossal cold accumulator that continued to radiate its icy breath even on relatively warm days. Even the largest, brightest, and hottest fire in the central hearth or massive fireplace could not effectively heat the entire huge volume of air in the spacious hall, 10 to 15 meters high. According to the inexorable laws of physics, the heat rose rapidly to the high-vaulted ceilings, where it accumulated uselessly under the stone arches, leaving piercing, icy drafts near the floor that flowed unhindered through the vast space. People sitting just a few meters from the bright flames could simultaneously feel the burning heat on their faces and feel the penetrating cold mercilessly chilling their backs. This problem was exacerbated by the architectural features of castles. High ceilings, necessary for defense and demonstration of power, created huge volumes of air that could not be effectively heated with the means available. Convection currents created constant air movement, with cold air sinking along the walls and warm air rising to the unreachable vaults, creating a vicious circle of heat loss. In large halls, there was often a thermal stratification effect, where the temperature at head level could be quite comfortable, while the feet were freezing from the cold rising from the stone floor. This forced people to constantly change position, seek the optimal distance from the fire, and place additional insulation under their feet. This critical problem was exacerbated by the complete lack of quality glazing in most of the castle's numerous window openings. Glass panes were incredibly expensive and only available to the wealthiest owners, so the windows were covered with rough wooden shutters, oiled fabric for waterproofing, or thin translucent plates made of carefully processed ox horn. None of these improvised glazing solutions could provide the necessary airtightness, and the icy winter wind freely penetrated the castle through multiple cracks and gaps, creating constant drafts.
It is getting colder by the minute.
Even when the windows were tightly closed, cold air seeped through the masonry, between the stones, and through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The windows facing north, which were almost never warmed by the sun, suffered particularly badly. In winter, frost formed on the inside surface of the shutters, and on particularly cold nights, a thin crust of ice. Some castles tried to solve the problem by using double shutters with an air gap between them, or by filling the space between the outer and inner shutters with dry straw or wool. These solutions helped, but they could not radically change the situation.
It is still so cold in here.
My back is freezing.
Therefore, the concept of centralized heating for the entire castle did not exist as such. It was technically impossible and economically impractical with the available technology. Instead of a futile attempt to heat the entire castle, there were carefully organized local islands of warmth around which the entire nightlife of the fortress's inhabitants was concentrated. The main strategic task was not to heat the entire massive castle, but to ensure survival and keep warm in strictly defined areas within this cold stone world. These islands of warmth were created around fireplaces, stoves, and even simple braziers with coals. Each such island had its own sphere of influence, an area where one could stay in relative comfort. People moved from one island to another, like travelers in the desert moving from oasis to oasis. On particularly cold nights, the entire feudal family could move into one room, usually the smallest and best insulated, where it was easier to maintain an acceptable temperature. It was a practical solution that prioritized survival over social status and propriety. To effectively combat the insidious cold of stone walls, multi-layered draperies and luxurious tapestries were used everywhere. Heavy tapestries, often genuine works of art, were hung not directly against the cold stone, but at a carefully calculated distance, creating an insulating air gap between the fabric and the wall. This seemingly simple but ingenious engineering technique significantly reduced critical heat loss and made the room much more bearable and comfortable. The most valuable tapestries were made of thick wool with a high pile, which created additional air pockets. Sometimes double draperies were used. A thinner fabric was hung directly on the wall, and the main tapestry was placed on top of it at a distance of 10-15 centimeters. This system created two air gaps and significantly increased the thermal insulation properties. Wealthy castle owners ordered special winter and summer sets of draperies. The winter ones were thicker, darker in color for better absorption of heat from the fire, and were often lined with fur or additional layers of fabric. Summer draperies were lighter and were intended more for beauty than for warmth. The floor in castles was also a constant and serious source of cold. Whether it was a polished stone floor in the ceremonial halls or simply trampled earth in the service rooms. For effective insulation, it was necessarily covered with a thick, dense layer of fresh straw or specially made dry reed mats, which had good thermal insulation properties. In the rich chambers of the nobility, expensive oriental carpets, brought from afar by caravans and costing a fortune, could be laid on top of the practical straw with ostentatious luxury. However, the stone floor was not just cold, it actively drew heat away from everything that came into contact with it. Even thick shoes did not always save you from the feeling that your feet were literally freezing to the floor. Therefore, in winter, an additional wooden floor was sometimes laid on top of the stone in private rooms, creating an air cushion between the main floor and the temporary covering. This multi-layered insulating layer not only effectively insulated from the cold, but also inevitably absorbed everything that was spilled and fell on it in the course of daily life. Food scraps, spilled drinks, dirt from shoes. It was changed extremely infrequently, usually several times during the winter, so the overall hygienic conditions in the castle left much to be desired. However, in the relentless battle for survival and warmth, considerations of cleanliness and hygiene inevitably took a back seat. The most effective and proven way to keep warm in the castle was to use various textiles on a large scale to create insulated spaces. Heavy, multi-layered woolen and luxurious fur curtains completely separated the sleeping alcoves from the main room, creating a kind of autonomous room within a room with its own microclimate. It was inside these carefully insulated fabric shelters that one could find real refuge from the merciless nighttime cold. These textile shelters were often equipped with additional heat sources. Metal braziers with smoldering coals, hot water bottles filled with hot water, or heated stones. Wealthy families could afford fur bedding and blankets made of sable, ermine, or bear skins, which provided excellent thermal insulation. The creation of sleeping alcoves was a special art. They were designed in such a way as to minimize the volume of air that needed to be heated, while ensuring sufficient ventilation so that people would not suffocate from lack of oxygen. Experienced craftsmen knew the optimal proportions of such shelters and knew how to create the most effective thermal refuges. Even everyday furniture in the castle was designed and manufactured with the vital necessity of preserving and accumulating heat in mind. The high, massive backs of chairs and benches effectively protected those sitting from constant drafts, creating areas of relative thermal comfort behind them, while luxurious canopies over the beds performed the same critical function as the insulating curtains in the alcoves. Each individual element of the castle's interior was an integral part of an overall well-thought-out strategy for survival in extreme conditions. Chairs and benches were often made with additional elements to retain heat, armrests that protected against side drafts, high backs that created a thermal screen, and special footrests that raised the feet above the cold floor. Some pieces of furniture were equipped with secret compartments for hot water bottles or small braziers. Beds in castles were complex engineering structures designed to retain as much heat as possible. A high platform raised the sleeping area above the cold floor, thick curtains created an insulated space, and sometimes special boxes with heated stones or braziers with coals were placed under the bed for additional heating. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think could have been used as effective insulation in the Middle Ages, apart from woolen fabrics? Please share your thoughts in the comments. The heart of the castle and the main source of heat at night was a huge hearth located in the center of the Great Hall. Before the advent of wall-mounted fireplaces with chimneys, it served as the main heating device. Its size was impressive. The diameter could reach several meters. The fire in such a hearth was kept burning around the clock, requiring an enormous amount of firewood. Fuel preparation was one of the most important tasks of the entire castle economy. Wood was cut in the summer, dried and stored in huge wood piles, which had to last for the entire long winter. The efficiency of the central hearth was extremely low. Most of the heat escaped upwards through an opening in the roof designed to allow smoke to escape. This opening, called a lucarne, was rarely closed completely so that people would not suffocate, and cold air entered the hall through it. All the nightlife of the castle was concentrated around the hearth. Here on the floor, spread out on straw mattresses and skins, slept the servants, squires, and soldiers of the garrison who did not have separate rooms. Proximity to the fire was a privilege, and places were allocated according to hierarchy. The smoke from the hearth was a real nuisance. It filled the entire hall, settling as soot on the walls, ceiling beams, and the lungs of the sleeping people. The walls of the castle were black not from age, but from a constant layer of soot. In addition to heating, the hearth also served a social function. Here stories were told, songs were sung, and the events of the past day were discussed. It was the only place where all the inhabitants of the castle, from simple servants to knights, could feel part of a single community. When night fell, special screens made of wood or fabric were placed around the fire. They reflected the heat back to the people and protected them from drafts. These simple devices significantly increased the comfort of spending the night in the cold hall. Control over the fire was very strict. A specially appointed person made sure that the flames did not become too strong and that sparks did not fall on wooden structures or straw mattresses. A night fire was one of the most terrible disasters. Food cooked on this same fire was distributed to the hall's inhabitants before bedtime. Hot soup or porridge not only satisfied their hunger, but also provided the body with additional warmth. After dinner, the hall gradually sank into a restless sleep to the crackling of wood and the howling of the wind. But if the main hall was relatively cozy, what about the private quarters of the lord and his family, where a large fire was impossible? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of heating the most private and protected rooms of the castle, and you will be surprised at how inventive medieval engineers were. The private quarters of the lord and his family, known as the solar, were the most comfortable and warmest rooms in the castle. Their location was carefully thought out. Often the solar was located above the Great Hall to use the heat rising from the hearth to warm the floor. The main innovation that ensured comfort in the private quarters was the wall-mounted fireplace. Unlike the central hearth, it had a chimney that effectively vented smoke outside. This allowed people to enjoy the warmth of the fire without soot and smoke. The design of the fireplace was a real engineering achievement. It was built of stone or brick, and the inside of the firebox was laid at an angle for better heat transfer to the room. The chimney created a draft that made combustion more efficient. However, even a fireplace could not completely heat a stone room. Therefore, the main comfort zone was the space directly in front of it. Here, high-backed chairs, tables, and benches were placed, where the lord's family spent their evenings. Portable metal or ceramic braziers were used for additional heating. They were filled with hot coals from the fireplace and carried to different parts of the room. This was an effective but extremely dangerous solution due to the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. Special attention was paid to the bed. A four-poster bed with a thick canopy and heavy curtains was not a luxury, but a necessity. It created an enclosed space that could be warmed by the heat of one's own body. Before going to bed, the bed was prepared in a special way. So-called bed warmers were used. Metal vessels with long handles. Hot coals were poured inside, and a servant passed such a warmer between the sheets to warm up the cold bed. As an alternative to coals, smoothly polished stones or bricks heated in the fireplace could be used. They were wrapped in thick cloth and placed at the feet. Such a device could retain heat for several hours, ensuring a peaceful sleep. The mattress itself was not stuffed with straw, as was the case with commoners, but with down, feathers, or wool, which provided better insulation. Several layers of linen sheets were laid on top, and heavy woolen blankets and fur covers were used. Thus, the lord's nighttime comfort was ensured by a whole range of measures. The well-thought-out layout of the room, the presence of a fireplace, the use of braziers, and a carefully insulated bed created an island of warmth and comfort in the middle of the cold stone mass of the castle. When darkness fell, the castle's security depended entirely on the vigilance of the night watch. Guard duty was one of the most difficult and responsible duties. The lives of all the inhabitants of the fortress depended on the vigilance and endurance of the sentries. The main posts were the towers and walls of the castle. The guards had to patrol the battlements, constantly scanning the surroundings for approaching enemies. Particular attention was paid to the gates, the most vulnerable part of any fortress. The watch lasted several hours and was divided into shifts called guards. The changing of the guard was marked by the sound of a horn or the ringing of a bell, which could be heard throughout the castle. These sounds were an integral part of the nighttime acoustic landscape of the fortress. The main enemies of the sentry were not only enemies, but also cold and sleep. Staying outdoors in the wind for many hours in winter required incredible endurance. In order not to fall asleep on duty, the guards had to keep moving. Candle lanterns or oil lamps were used to light the posts. Their light was dim and protected from the wind by walls made of horn plates. Open torches on wooden walls were avoided due to the high risk of fire. Guards were also stationed inside the castle. They patrolled the inner courtyard and checked that the storerooms and arsenals were locked. They had to prevent any attempts at intrusion or sabotage from within. Communication between posts was maintained using code signals. The cry of a sentry, the sound of a horn of a certain tone, or a lit signal fire instantly alerted the entire garrison. The warning system was simple but reliable. In some castles, small stone or wooden booths were built on the walls to shelter the sentries from the weather. However, more often than not, the guard was alone with the icy wind and darkness. His only protection was warm clothing. In addition to observing the surroundings, the night guard's duties included maintaining order inside the castle. They made sure that all lights except for those on duty were extinguished after the signal to retire. This was a key element of fire safety. What helped the guards stay warm during their long hours on duty in the icy wind? In the next chapter, you will learn what their clothing was made of and what simple techniques they used to stay warm. Properly selected clothing was absolutely crucial and often a decisive factor in survival in the mercilessly cold castle, especially critical for the night watch, who had to serve on the open walls and towers in all weather conditions. The basis of the entire medieval wardrobe was the centuries-old principle of scientifically based layering. Several carefully selected layers of relatively thin clothing retained the precious heat of the human body much more effectively than a single, even very thick layer, as the air pockets between the layers provided additional insulation and prevented convective heat loss. The principle of layering was based on an intuitive understanding of the laws of heat transfer. Each layer of clothing created an air gap that acted as a natural insulator. The air trapped between the layers of fabric was heated by the body and created a protective thermal barrier. In addition, the multi-layer system allowed body temperature to be regulated by removing or adding layers depending on conditions and physical activity. Experienced castle dwellers knew that each layer had to be loose and not constrict blood circulation, as tight clothing disrupted blood flow and led to rapid freezing of the extremities. Particular attention was paid to ventilation. Clothing had to allow excess moisture to escape while retaining heat. The bottom base layer, which was in direct contact with the skin, was a mandatory linen shirt and long breeches, which were sewn from high-quality linen fabric. Linen, being a natural plant fiber, had an excellent ability to absorb moisture and remove it from the surface of the body, preventing the formation of wet areas that could quickly lead to hypothermia. However, linen itself did not retain heat well, and when wet, became practically useless as insulation. So clothing made of wool of various types and qualities was always worn over linen underwear. Linen underwear was made from carefully processed flax. The fibers were soaked, dried, beaten, and spun into thin but strong threads. The quality of linen underwear was an indicator of status. The nobility wore thin, almost silky linen underwear, while commoners had to make do with coarse but practical cloth. Regularly changing linen underwear was an important hygiene requirement, although this was not always possible in a castle. Woolen clothing was worn over linen underwear, a material that had truly unique thermal insulation properties even when wet, making it indispensable in the high humidity of stone castles. Wool fibers have a complex structure with many air pockets that trap warm air and create an effective thermal barrier. In addition, wool has natural water-repellent properties due to its lanolin content. The quality of woolen clothing varied greatly depending on the origin of the wool. The most valuable was the wool of merino sheep, which was soft, fine, and had excellent thermal insulation properties. Coarser wool from ordinary sheep was used for the everyday clothing of servants and soldiers. The wool of young lambs was particularly prized for its exceptional softness and warmth. Woolen products were dyed with natural dyes, ranging from simple brown and gray tones to expensive bright colors obtained from rare plants and minerals. The color of clothing often indicated the social status of the owner. Bright, saturated colors were the privilege of the nobility. Outerwear consisted of a long tunic or caftan, also made of particularly thick, often felted wool, which provided maximum protection from wind and cold. For extra warmth during particularly cold periods, special vests and sleeveless jackets were used, carefully lined with expensive sable, marten, fox, or more affordable sheepskin. The warmest and most prestigious part of the entire wardrobe was a long cloak with a deep hood, which reliably protected the wearer from the biting wind, rain, snow, and other adverse weather conditions. Cloaks were made of particularly dense fabric, often wax-coated for waterproofing. The most luxurious cloaks were lined with fur and decorated with embroidery or the fur of rare animals. The hood was not just a fashion accessory, but a vital element. The head and neck were particularly vulnerable to heat loss, and a good hood could save a life in extreme conditions. The The fastenings on outer garments were made as secure as possible, using metal buckles, leather straps, and bone or wooden buttons. The quality of the fastenings was critical, as unfastened clothing lost most of its insulating properties. The footwear of the guards and other inhabitants of the castle consisted of high leather boots, carefully insulated from the inside with thick felt or various types of fur, sheep, goat, and in wealthy families even sable or beaver. The feet were additionally wrapped in special woolen foot cloths, which had an important practical advantage. They could be quickly turned inside out if they got wet during service. Warm mittens made of leather or thick woolen fabric were worn on the hands, often lined with fur for additional protection against frostbite. Making high-quality shoes was a real art. The leather was chosen with particular care. Preference was given to thick but flexible bull or horse leather. The soles were made in several layers, sometimes with wooden inserts for additional insulation from the cold ground. The seams were treated with grease or wax to make them waterproof. Foot cloths were a universal solution. They could be washed and dried, absorbed moisture well, and, when used correctly, prevented calluses from forming. The skill of winding foot cloths correctly was passed down from generation to generation and was considered an important practical skill. The inhabitants of the castle usually slept without undressing completely, since the stone walls did not accumulate heat, but on the contrary actively absorbed it. Usually only the outer clothing, cloaks, caftans, and heavy shoes were removed, leaving the wearer in woolen tunics and trousers. Sleeping in just a light nightshirt was an exclusive privilege of the highest nobility, who slept in beds that were well protected from drafts and additionally heated, with multiple curtains and canopies. The art of sleeping in clothes required special skills. One had to be able to loosen belts and fasteners so as not to interfere with blood circulation, while maintaining the thermal insulation properties of the clothing. Many slept in special night tunics, looser and softer than daytime clothing, but still warm enough. On particularly cold nights, people slept in hats and even light shoes. They only removed metal parts of their clothing, buckles, jewelry, which became painfully cold when in contact with the skin. The bedding of most of the castle's inhabitants was extremely simple and utilitarian. The basis of the sleeping place was a straw mattress, a large bag made of coarse but durable fabric, tightly stuffed with fresh straw, hay, or other available organic materials. The straw in the mattresses was changed periodically, usually several times a year, but it still became a breeding ground for dust, dirt, and various parasites over time, creating additional hygiene problems. The wealthier inhabitants of the castle could afford mattresses stuffed with sheep's wool or even goose down. Such bedding was much warmer and more comfortable, but also many times more expensive. Wool mattresses had better thermal insulation properties and were less susceptible to parasite infestation. People covered themselves with heavy woolen blankets of varying thickness or with tanned animal skins: sheep, goat, bear, or wolf. Often, several people slept under one large shared blanket to effectively warm each other with their natural body heat. This was a completely normal and widespread practice for servants, soldiers, and other people of low social status. In the luxurious chambers of the nobility, the beds were much more comfortable and technologically advanced. Soft down or feather mattresses, thin linen sheets of the highest quality, and a variety of blankets and expensive fur covers made of sable, ermine, and marten provided maximum warmth and comfort. However, even in these luxurious conditions, the relentless stone cold constantly made itself felt, forcing even the most noble people to wrap themselves in additional blankets and constantly seek sources of heat. Noble families often used special bed warmers, metal vessels with hot coals or heated stones, which were placed in the bed before bedtime. These primitive warmers were the predecessors of modern electric blankets and significantly increased sleeping comfort. The beds of the nobility were complex structures with canopies, curtains, and multiple mattresses. Sometimes double mattresses were used, the lower one, harder, for support, and the upper one, soft, for comfort. Sheets were changed regularly, which was a rare luxury in medieval conditions. Pillows were also a real luxury and a clear indicator of social status. The vast majority of people used their rolled-up clothes, cloaks, tunics, or simply a hard wooden log wrapped in cloth as a makeshift headboard. Proper, soft pillows stuffed with goose or swan feathers were only available to the wealthiest and most influential inhabitants of the castle and cost a fortune. The manufacture of high-quality pillows required special skill. The down and feathers had to be carefully cleaned and processed, and the covers were sewn from thin linen or even imported silk. The size and number of pillows indicated the wealth of the owner. Some noble persons had several pillows of different sizes and firmness. Ordinary people sometimes made pillows stuffed with straw, hay, or even sawdust, but such products were hard and short-lived. More practical were pillows stuffed with wool or rags. They were softer than straw and lasted longer. Thus, clothing and bedding in the harsh Middle Ages served not so much an aesthetic or decorative function as a vital utilitarian one. They were real tools for survival, carefully thought-out life support systems that allowed people to survive long, dark, and mercilessly cold winter nights in unheated stone fortresses. Every item of clothing and every detail of bedding had its own purpose in the overall strategy of combating the cold, and human life often depended on their correct use. As the sun set, the castle was plunged into thick, almost palpable darkness. Artificial lighting was expensive and inefficient, so it was used sparingly. Most of the night, the castle was in darkness, broken only by rare lights. The main source of light for commoners was a splinter. It was a thin, long piece of dry wood that was inserted into a special holder called a splinter holder. The splinter burned quickly, smoked heavily, and required constant attention. Wealthier people could afford tallow candles. They were made from animal fat, most often beef or mutton. Such candles burned longer than splinters, but they emitted an unpleasant odor and smoked heavily, and the wick had to be constantly adjusted. The height of luxury was beeswax candles. They burned brightly, evenly, produced almost no smoke, and smelled pleasant. However, their cost was so high that only the wealthiest feudal lords and the church could afford them. Torches could be used in large halls and on walls. They consisted of a stick wrapped in resin or fat-soaked tow. Torches gave off a lot of light, but also a lot of smoke, and falling sparks created a constant fire hazard. Oil lamps were also used. The simplest lamp was a clay or metal dish filled with oil into which a wick was dipped. They were more economical than candles but gave a dim, flickering light. Large spaces, such as the great hall or the kitchen, were mainly lit by the flames of the hearth or fireplace. People tried to do all the necessary work before nightfall. Night was a time for rest and sleep, not for active pursuits. To move around the castle at night, a hand lantern was required. It consisted of a candle placed in a casing with thin horn plates instead of glass. The lantern protected the flame from the wind and allowed the path to be lit without the risk of causing a fire. The consumption of lighting materials was strictly controlled. Candles and oil were issued to managers in limited quantities. Burning lights for no purpose was considered unacceptable wastefulness. How were all these sources of fire controlled to prevent fires? In the next chapter, we will look at the strict fire safety rules that existed in medieval castles. Fire was one of the most terrible disasters that could happen in a castle at night. The combination of open flames for lighting and heating, with an abundance of wooden structures, straw, and textiles, created ideal conditions for a fire to start. Therefore, fire safety rules were strict, albeit unwritten. The main rule was the evening signal to extinguish the lights, known as extinguish the lights, from the French couvre-feu, which gave rise to the word curfew. At this signal, all the inhabitants of the castle, except the guards, had to extinguish candles, lamps, and torches. Fires were only allowed to remain lit in the main fireplaces under supervision. A special patrol was assigned to monitor compliance with this rule. These people walked around the castle, checking that all the lights were extinguished. Violators faced severe punishment. In case of fire, barrels of water and boxes of sand were always kept at strategic points in the castle, at the gates, in the stables, in the kitchen, and in the arsenal. These were the simplest but only available means of firefighting. Every inhabitant of the castle knew where they were located. Particular attention was paid to the kitchen, where the fires in the hearths burned almost constantly. At night, the flames were not completely extinguished, but covered with ashes to keep the embers smoldering until morning. This allowed the fire to be quickly rekindled at dawn, but required constant supervision. Wooden structural elements were isolated from sources of fire. Fireplaces were built into thick stone walls, and wooden ceiling beams were placed at a safe distance from chimneys. The floor around the central hearth was made of stone. Despite all the precautions, fires were not uncommon. The cause could be an accidental spark falling on a straw mattress, an overturned candle, or a faulty chimney. Fighting fires in the cramped and cluttered rooms of the castle was extremely difficult. The frequent ringing of the castle bell served as a fire alarm. Upon hearing it, all men capable of holding a bucket were required to run to the scene of the fire. Extinguishing the fire was a collective responsibility. Wooden roofs, interior partitions, and staircases were instantly engulfed in flames. The main task during a fire was not so much to extinguish the fire as to localize it, preventing it from spreading to other buildings, especially food warehouses and the arsenal. Thus, nightlife in the castle was marked by constant vigilance. The threat of fire was no less real than the threat of enemy attack and required discipline and responsibility from all inhabitants. Every evening, the castle underwent a strict ritual of closing and switching to night mode. This procedure was vital for ensuring the security and control of the fortress. It transformed the castle from a bustling center of daytime life into a hermetically sealed and guarded citadel. It all began with a signal given by a horn or bell. This sound meant that all fieldwork had to be stopped and the peasants from the surrounding villages who had sought protection within the castle walls had to return home. The gates were prepared for closure. The next step was to raise the drawbridge. This massive wooden bridge, spanning the moat, was raised with chains and winches. When raised, it became an additional barrier, blocking access to the gate. Then a heavy wrought iron grate, called a portcullis, was lowered. It slid down special grooves in the walls of the gate tower, completely blocking the passage. Even if the enemy managed to break through the outer gate, the grate would be a serious obstacle for them. After that, the main gate itself was closed and locked with massive bolts. It was made of thick oak planks and reinforced with iron. The keys to the gate and the winch mechanisms were kept by the castle commander, castellan, or the chief guard. In addition to the main gate, all other entrances to the castle, including small wickets and secret passages, were also locked. Each entrance was personally checked by the guard commander. The castle became completely isolated from the outside world. Important rooms inside the castle were also locked. The armory, treasury, and food stores were all sealed or locked. Access to them at night was strictly limited. The closing procedure was accompanied by a change of the day guard to the night guard. The new guard commander took up his post, received instructions and keys. He was fully responsible for the security of the castle until morning. This ritual was repeated day after day for centuries. It was worked out to the smallest detail and instilled a sense of security in the castle's inhabitants. The sound of the drawbridge being raised and the clang of the portcullis being lowered signaled that the day's cares were over and the castle was ready to face the night. In the morning, the procedure was repeated in reverse order. At dawn, the castle opened again, returning to its normal daytime life. This daily cycle of closing and opening was the rhythm by which every medieval fortress lived. After a hard day, the last meal of the day was particularly important. Dinner at the castle was the main meal, after which most of the inhabitants went to bed. Hot and hearty food helped to warm up and store energy for the cold night. The menu depended on status. The lord and his family dined in the great hall at a separate table on a raised platform and were served several dishes, including meat, poultry, and pastries. The garrison and servants received simple but high-calorie food, usually thick soup or porridge with bread. The main drinks were ale or beer for the commoners and wine for the nobility. They not only quenched thirst but were also an important source of calories. Water from wells was often unsafe, so low-alcohol drinks were preferred. After dinner, the kitchen did not stop working completely. The cooks left a pot of soup on the stove for the night watch. Hot food was necessary for the guards to maintain their strength during long hours on duty in the cold. Personal food supplies in rooms were rare. Food was stored centrally in warehouses and cellars under the strict control of the manager. This was necessary to prevent theft and ensure the fair distribution of supplies, especially during a siege. Cellars and basements were ideal places to store food. The constant low temperature and darkness allowed root vegetables, pickles, and barrels of wine and beer to remain fresh for a long time. However, these rooms required protection from rodents. Grain was stored in special barns, dry and well-ventilated rooms. Flour was ground as needed, as grain could be stored much longer. The security of grain stores was one of the main priorities. Meat and fish were preserved by salting, drying, or smoking. Fresh meat was only available after hunting or slaughtering livestock. The rest of the time, the diet consisted mainly of canned foods. At night, all warehouses and cellars were securely locked. The keys were kept by responsible persons, and access to food was strictly regulated. A nighttime trip to the kitchen or pantry was a serious offense. Thus, the food system in the castle was strictly organized. Dinner was the last important event of the day, after which food supplies were kept under special control until the next morning. At night, the castle was transformed, changing its sound palette. The daytime noise, the clang of metal in the smithy, the cries of merchants in the courtyard, the barking of dogs, was replaced by almost complete silence. This silence was special, filled with its own barely discernible sounds. The main sound of the castle at night was the wind. It howled in the chimneys, whistled in the narrow loopholes, and made the wooden shutters creak. In stormy weather, it seemed as if the fortress itself was groaning under its pressure. Inside the rooms, the silence was broken by the crackling of wood in the fireplace and the steady ticking of water dripping through the stone arches in the cellars. From the great hall, where the servants and soldiers slept, came the friendly snoring of dozens of people. The old wooden beams and floors creaked periodically in response to changes in temperature. This silence was deceptive, and the guards learned to distinguish alarming sounds within it. An unusual creak, the sound of a falling stone, or a muffled rustle behind a wall could be a sign of an approaching enemy. At night, hearing became the main sense for the sentry. Every hour, the silence was pierced by an agreed signal. It could be a guard shouting from the tower, confirming that everything was in order, or a bell ringing to mark the time. These sounds served as a guide in the darkness and confirmation that the castle was under guard. The inhabitants of the castle grew accustomed to these nighttime sounds. They became the background to which it was customary to fall asleep. On the contrary, sudden, absolute silence could cause more anxiety than any noise. Psychologically, nighttime in the castle was a difficult time. The combination of cold, almost complete darkness and confined space weighed heavily on the psyche. A lone sentry on the wall could easily succumb to the imagination, seeing enemies in the dancing shadows. At night, the interior of the castle turned into a labyrinth of dark corridors and staircases. It was almost impossible to move around without a lantern. Even people who knew the castle well risked stumbling or getting lost. Dawn brought great relief. The first rays of sunlight breaking through the battlements dispelled not only the darkness, but also the nighttime fears. The castle slowly awoke, and its soundscape was once again filled with the familiar daytime noises. The castle's nightlife was a hidden but integral part of its existence. It was a time of trials, vigilance, and struggle for survival, in which the main enemies were cold, darkness, and silence. We conclude our journey into the dark and cold nights of a medieval castle. Today we have seen that behind the romantic image of stone giants lay a harsh reality, where every evening turned into a complex operation for survival. Warmth was a luxury, light was a commodity, and safety was the result of constant vigilance. From the huge smoky hearth in the great hall to the ingeniously designed bed of the feudal lord, from the icy posts of the night watch to the strict rituals of closing the gates, the entire life of the castle was subordinated to one goal: to survive the darkness and wait for dawn. This experience shows how inventive and resilient the people of that era were, capable of creating their own world even in the harshest conditions. What aspect of nightlife in the castle did you find most challenging and unexpected? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next dives into history.